Okay, folks. I don't know whether you got my email this morning, but about the bot. I don't know whether I want the bot to work really well or really badly. You see how I have mixed feelings about it? Now, if it works really, really well, I'm in deep trouble. I've just been outsourced. If it works really, really badly, that's a reflection on the fact that, that the bot, my name is attached to the bot. So I'm pulling for each of you to beat the bot, though. I mean, I think that I know that about a dozen of you have volunteered. Thank you. And I will pass your names on. Completely voluntary. Okay. So let's talk about pricing. Today, we're going to actually complete much of the rest of pricing. So I'm going to go back and revisit something we did last week to make sure things nail down. Remember I said with PEG ratios, you're assuming that P grows proportionately with the growth rate. You know what I mean by that, right? Growth doubles, P doubles. Let's assume you decide to overlook that and use PEG ratios anyway. So you're taking the P, you divide by the growth rate. Given the fact that P grows less than proportionately, what types of stocks are you going to bias yourself against, right? You see what I'm asking, right? So you're using PEG ratios, you're avoiding stocks with high PEG ratios. What types of stocks are you going to end up over-investing in, and which ones are you going to under-invest in? Low growth, high growth, or is there no direction that you see? Sebastian, you want to try? You'll end up with a lower PEG ratio. It'll look cheap to you, even though it's not cheap, right? So if I pick based on PEG ratios, high growth companies are going to look insanely cheap to me. And any low growth company is going to look expensive, not because they're cheap or expensive, but because of the skew in the PEG ratio. So when you look at PEG ratios, be very careful. When somebody says this stock is cheap, it's a risky stock, but it's low PEG ratio. Let me follow up on this. EV to EBITDA. Remember the EV is market. Let's suppose I do EV the way lazy people do it. Take market cap, add debt, subtract out cash, divide by EBITDA. And I do this for every company in my group. But the company I'm looking at has minority holdings in other companies. You know what that means, right? Go back to your cross-holding from quiz 2. These are 5%, 10%, 15% of other companies, the minority holdings of other companies. What's going to happen to the stock on an EV to EBITDA basis? Will it look cheap or will it look expensive? Come on, you got a 50-50 shot. What do you think will happen? I'll get you started. You have a lot of minority holdings, right? What's that going to do to your market cap? It's going to go up. Your market cap is going to be higher. You add debt, you subtract out cash, and then you divide by EBITDA. But what's the nature of minority holdings? The EBITDA doesn't show up there. So your numerator gets inflated, your denominator stays where it is. If you're not careful, companies with a lot of cross holdings are going to look expensive to you. Family group companies will look expensive on an EV to EBITDA basis because you've counted the good stuff in the numerator, but none of the stuff that comes with it in the denominator. So just go back and review the multiples, because today I'm going to talk about EV to sales ratios. So let me go back to your to where we were in the notes, and we just got to revenue multiples. Help me out here. Why do people use revenue multiples? What's the nice thing about revenue multiples? Yeah.
When you can use anything else.
One is, remember with price earnings ratios, we lost what, 3,600 companies because they had negative earnings. Have you ever seen a company with negative revenues? I don't think I have yet. I always leave the door open because some companies can be really creative. So you're not going to lose as many companies. That's a good thing. From a statistical standpoint, there's less bias. But it is true, desperation drives you there. In a sector where everybody's losing money, use revenue multiples. Those revenue multiples can be defined in one of two ways. The inconsistent way is to take market cap and divide by revenues. I don't like it, but a lot of people use it in sectors like technology. They get away with it because there's not much debt. The right way to get a revenue multiple is to do the enterprise value, market value of equity plus debt minus cash, divided by revenues. In either case, you are getting a number that's less contaminated by accounting choices. And that can be a big plus when you're comparing across companies. So let's look at what drives an enterprise value to sales ratio. Remind me again, what kind of, remember when we did the analytics, we said you start with a multiple. Is it either an equity multiple or an enterprise value multiple? This is, of course, if I'm doing enterprise value to sales, will be an enterprise value multiple. So how do I figure out what drives that multiple? What do I do if I have an enterprise value multiple and I want to see what drives that multiple? I go back to an enterprise value discounted cash flow model, right? Free cash flow of the firm divided by cost of capital minus growth. Then I do the algebra. Why am I doing the algebra? Because in the process, I can unearth what the variables are that drive the multiple. So I'll cut to the chase. I won't bore you by taking through the entire formulation, but I actually did a two-stage dividend discount model. And I came up with the EV to sales ratio, at least on an intrinsic basis. And here are the variables that drive an EV to sales ratio. It's a function of your reinvestment rate. Higher reinvestment rates translate to lower multiples of revenues. It's a function of your cost of capital. Riskier companies have lower EV to sales ratios. It's a function of your growth rate. Higher growth companies have higher EV to sales ratios. But here's the variable that pops up that's unique to revenue multiples. Your revenue multiple is also affected by operating margin. High margin companies have high EV to sales ratios. Low margin companies have low EV to sales ratios. Here's what I'm going to do though. I mean, that multiple clearly can be estimated for any company. I want to talk about how you can use this multiple answer one of the big questions in marketing. I'm not a marketing person, I'll admit it up front. But looking at the outside, marketing people make a big deal about brand name, right? Entire classes around brand name. I've never understood how you stretch out over 26 sessions a concept like brand name, but you must have stuff to do. But help me out here, and we've talked about this before. What is the value of having a strong brand name? What does it allow you to do? Sachi? It gives you pricing power. And yesterday I bought my Zyrtec. Last week, if you remember, I was drooling and passing, all kinds of bodily fluids were coming out of me while I was teaching. I'm sure it is disgusting. I apologize in hindsight, but there's nothing I could do. So I went in to get my Zyrtec. You know that once you take Zyrtec, you can never leave, right? Because once you take Zyrtec and you stop taking it, your body starts itching all over. I'm not kidding. Your whole body, your eyelids, everything. You're addicted to Zyrtec. I am at this stage completely addicted to Zyrtec. So I went to get Zyrtec, and Zyrtec is now off patent. You can get Zyrtec, or you can get the CVS version of Zyrtec. Exactly the same drug, but it's about 40% cheaper. Why is Zyrtec still able to charge a premium? Brand name. Right? So if brand name power shows up in pricing power, it's going to show up as a higher margin. If there's a higher margin, what happens to EV to sales ratio? It'll be higher. I'm going to use that opening to estimate what the value of a brand name is. So I'm going to use a company that has a legendary brand name, Coca-Cola. About 20 years ago, I get a call from somebody who works at Coca-Cola who took my class a long, long time ago. He'd risen up the ranks in Coca-Cola. He was at, top management. He said, can you come to Atlanta and talk to our management team about the value of Coca-Cola's brand name because they're obsessed about it in this building. I said, sure, show up. I walk into a room with a can of Pepsi in my hand. It's always good to keep people off balance, right? And they're the top management team, their marketing person, production, finance. And I did an intrinsic valuation of Coca-Cola. What's an intrinsic valuation? I took them through cash flows, growth, and risk, and came up with a value of about $80 billion for Coca-Cola. I finished, and the head marketing honcho sitting, right there in the front row, puts up his hand. And he says, you missed something very important. And I said, what did I miss? A beverage, a geography, maybe? He said, you missed the fact that Coca-Cola is the most valuable brand name in the world. That's a little delusional in 2004 to think you still have the most valuable. But there was a time when Coca-Cola had the most valuable brand name in the world. I said, okay, what exactly do you want me to do? He said, you should be adding at least a 20% premium to that $80 billion. I said, why? He said, that's what we do at Coca-Cola is when we buy brand name companies in other countries, we value them and then we add 20%. I said, just because you do stupid things doesn't mean I have to do stupid things as well. He said, don't you think our brand name has value? I said, it's the only thing in this building that has any value. I'm not sure any of you adds to that value, right? Because the more you try, the less remember all those people involved in the new Coke, old Coke fiasco? Maybe you should just leave the thing alone. Let a chat GPT run the whole company. I didn't say that then because there was no chat GPT. He said, but so why aren't you adding a premium? I said, it's already in there. One of my favorite commercials of all time. It's about 40 years old. You might find it on Google. And here's how the commercial goes. There's this old Italian lady in a kitchen stirring a big pot of spaghetti sauce. And her son, who's like 45 years old, shows up for dinner. And this guy must be a big time loser because he clearly shows up for dinner multiple times every week. He comes into the kitchen. He says, Mom, what are you doing? She says, I'm making spaghetti sauce. She's surrounded by empty bottles of ragu spaghetti sauce. He said, you always used to make it from scratch. You're making it out of a bottle. And then he starts listing the ingredients that are supposed to go in spaghetti sauce. I'm not that good at spaghetti sauce. If these ingredients don't belong, act like you didn't hear them. So where's the oregano? It's in there. Where's the tomatoes? It's in there. Where's the cayenne? It's in there. I'm Indian. I throw cayenne into everything, otherwise it doesn't taste good. But the reaction was, whatever it is, the answer was, it's in there. If you do a good discounted cash flow valuation, it should be like that ragu spaghetti sauce. It should be in there. There should be no garnishing after the fact. So I said, it's in there. He said, where? In your margins. Why do you think you have 15.57% margins? Do you think it's because of the nice can? Do you think it's the name? It's the taste? Nothing. It's your brand name. He said, I don't believe you. This is why I don't get into arguments with marketing people. But I came prepared because I knew this question was coming. So I said, let's play a game. Let's assume we wake up tomorrow with selective amnesia. And everybody in the world has forgotten that red can, the word Coca-Cola. Your brand name has disappeared. Think of what will happen to you as a company. First, in grocery stores, you no longer be in the front of the store. You'll be in the back of the store, right? A six-pack is not going to cost you $3. It's going to cost you $1.20. And here I got lucky. I found a Canadian company called COTT, C-O-T-T. You know, it sells almost as many cans of soda as Coca-Cola does. You've never heard of it, right? This is because they sell their sodas to grocery stores to stamp their own names on it. So you walk into a Pathmark or a ShopRite, you get a ShopRite soda. COTT made the soda. They spend nothing on advertising, no marketing. But they also sell these cans for close to nothing, 8 cents a can, 6 cents a can. Their margins are 5.28%. They're a generic soda company. So I said, let's say tomorrow you woke up and your brand name is gone. Guess what's going to happen? You've lost your pricing power. Your margins are going to drop. So think of this not as a valuation of Coca-Cola versus COTT, but Coca-Cola versus Coca-Cola with COTT's margins. Your margins drop. That's a first layer impact, right? That's bad. When you have lower margins, what happens to your return on capital? Your return on capital is actually your margin times your sales to capital ratio algebraically. So you have lower margins, you have lower returns on capital. So your return on capital drops. If your return on capital drops, your growth drops. Remember, if you're lower, you have a ripple effect that plays the way through. And if you have those lower margins, your value becomes 15.4 billion. You want me to add a brand name premium? I just did. I gave you a $64 billion premium. You don't think it's enough? Tell me why, but don't ask me to add 20% to the top. This approach works insanely well with beverage companies, with cereal companies. You know why? There's not really, let's be quite honest. Cornflakes is cornflakes. You say, but Kellogg's tastes so much better. That's a brand name playing games with your brain. It works less well if you have other things going on. If I ask you what's a brand name value for Apple, much more difficult to answer the question, right? Because if you think about the competitive advantage of Apple, there is a brand name value. You pay a higher price. I remember when Apple came out with these cleaning cloths for your computer with an Apple logo on them. $20 for a pack of 2. It's like little, if you walk into a dollar store, you can buy them for 50 cents a piece, but there's an Apple logo. There is a brand name. But there's also an operating system that's unique to Apple. There's a styling component that's unique to Apple. You could, when you try to value Apple's brand name, much more difficult to do because there are multiple competitive advantages driving that higher pricing. So any questions on brand name value? Yes, Nick. The word came out again, strategic acquisition. So tell me what made it strategic.
So what I would imagine, right, brand name example is, let's say I have a no-name brand and I want
no name at all. Okay.
Bigger somehow than a yes.
Okay.
So I buy a company with a brand name, and now I want to.
But why is that strategic? Because I can see the potential financial advantages, right? Basically, you're saying I have bigger factories, more production capacity. You have a brand name. Let's give it a, Celsius, right? Celsius is, but they're small still. So if you have Pepsi's capacity, there is a benefit. There's nothing strategic about it. There's synergy, which comes from combining two companies. It's completely financial. The reason I kind of blanched at the word strategic is the strategic could come out is if you paid a big price, but you couldn't tell me for what yet, right? You said something is going to happen here that will make this company valuable. So as a general rule, I think strategic should be reserved for things that don't fly with the numbers, but you really, really want to do them, right? And even there, you got to ask questions about what exactly am I doing? So could the brand name have a higher value to somebody else? Absolutely. But I could say that about any asset, right? You're a manufacturing company, it's entirely. So that is something we can ask as a different question. That's the value of control, that having control of this could give you a higher value. So, but that's not something I'm going to embed in the brand name today because that's a function of two players being in the game. Yes.
It's Celsius, you have a there, but the company get profitable, and that is like, how do you slap a margin on people?
When you value those companies, what drives your value? Many of you are valuing young, money-losing companies. What are the things that gave it value? One is revenue growth. The other is a target margin, right? So if you believe Celsius is a brand name, you're going to give it a premium margin. If you believe it's a generic name, you're going to give it a generic margin. In the beverage sector, you can see the variations in margins. So that's where it's going to play out. Right? Yes, go ahead.
Brand name could also impact growth in itself.
Well, you got to make a trade-off, right? Do you want higher prices or do you want to grow faster? You can't have your cake and eat it too. The reason you're able to charge a higher price is you're not trying to sell as much as you can. So if you prefer to have more revenues rather than higher margins, which input in my valuation would I use to show it? Remember that sales to invested capital measures how efficiently? So whatever your way of exploiting brand name is, I'll find a place to show it. But the bottom line is I will find a place to show it in the cash flows rather than have it come after the fact. So let's talk about, so we've defined, we've described, we've analyzed. Last step, we're going to apply these multiples, right? Two questions you're going to run into. One is, No, and many of you, I don't know how many of you have even started the pricing, but one of the first steps in pricing is finding a peer group, comparable firms. From an intrinsic value standpoint, you know what a comparable firm looks like, right? It's a firm with similar cash flows, similar growth, and similar risk. Nowhere in there did I say what sector you're in. I don't care. Cash flows, growth, and risk. But in the real world, it's true. We tend to think of comparable firms. We think software company, other software companies. Why do we do that? Because we're being lazy. We're saying if we take other software companies, they probably have similar margins, similar cash flows, similar growth, so I can compare them. So that's the first step, is how do we come up with a peer group? We'll talk about the choices you run into. Second, no matter how carefully you pick that peer group, when you're done, there'll still be differences between your company and the rest of that group. Difference in growth, difference in risk, and you have to figure out how to control for those differences. I want to focus in on those two issues. Let's start with the first one. You're trying to pick a peer group. I'm assuming you have access to capital like you still. You go in there and say, so let's say you're doing a beverage company. You have two choices, right? Let's say you're valuing Coca-Cola. You can look for all publicly traded beverage companies. Last time I checked on Capital IQ, there were about 300 publicly traded beverage companies. Right? This is good. But then you look down the list of those 300 beverage companies, you see that some are tiny, some are big, some are foreign markets, some are in the US. And already you can see the choice when it comes to peer groups. You can keep your peer group narrow and find companies just like yours. What did that leave you if you're looking at a Pepsi? If you're looking at a Coca-Cola, maybe 2 companies, 3 companies, or 4 companies. So your sample size is small, but the companies look very much like yours. The other is to keep your sample large and allow for the fact that companies will have differences in the fundamentals. You're saying which one's better? It depends on what you plan to do next. Because here are the 4 things you can do. One is you can try to do a direct comparison of your company to another company that you say is just like it. During the 20th century, if you were an auto analyst in the US, there were only 2 companies in your peer group. You know what the 2 companies were for much of the 20th century? GM and Ford. Chrysler was too small. So basically, this is what you did as an auto analyst. Does GM look cheap relative to Ford? Does Ford look cheap relative to GM? And the argument was the companies are so similar that you can just compare the two. And if one is cheap and the other is expensive, you'd buy the cheaper one, you sell the more expensive one, and hope that they converge. To do that, your companies have to be really, really similar. What's the chance of that happening? It could, I mean, there might be sectors, I don't know, Verizon and AT&T, are they close enough you can do this? But that's direct comparison. And some people like it because it's very intuitive. You stay with 2 companies, you don't have to clutter the. But the problem is you have a sample size of 2. The second is to have a larger sample size, but to tell a story to control for differences. What does that mean? You have a software company, you're comparing it to 10 other software companies. Your company has higher growth than the rest of the companies. Its PE ratio is higher, but you say it's okay because right now, when you see a buy recommendation in NVIDIA with the pricing, there are quite a few buy. In fact, I think almost every analyst recommendation in NVIDIA is a buy. And it's all pricing based. You say, how the heck can you find NVIDIA to be cheap? What are you comparing it to? It's amazing the acrobatics that people go through to end up with the buy. Say NVIDIA is trading at, I think it trades at what? Its revenues are what, 60 billion. Its market cap is close to 2 billion. That's 40 times revenues or the 30 times revenues. There isn't another semiconductor company that trades at more than 3 times revenues. How do you tell me that 30 times revenues is cheap? You have to do a lot of intellectual gymnastics to get there. So you throw in words like AI. That explains another 25 times revenues. The great management, Jensen Huang, another 5. This is the problem with storytelling. If I want to convince you to buy something, I'm going to find a story and say, because there's really no heft to the story, right? Nothing that restrains me from telling. The third is to try to adjust the multiple for the things that you think matter. Talked about peg ratios. Why did people invent peg ratios? Because in sectors, difference in growth. They got sick and tired of telling stories about difference in growth. They brought the growth into the peg ratio. They told us growth had gone away. That wasn't true. That's what you do with peg ratios. And there's a fourth approach, and you can already see where I'm going with the fourth approach. This is data perfect for statistics. You're trying to control for difference. Let the data tell you how much risk matters and growth matters. I know it's for the moment. You're saying, how the heck will the data tell me? But what I'm going to do actually is take a series of examples to illustrate this process. So here was my first stop. I've been hired as the beverage analyst. This was in, I think, 2009 or so. This is my sector. I'm going to play the role of the beverage analyst. I'm going to put out recommendations. You know enough by now to push back. So I take the sector and I put out 3 buy recommendations. I list out my 3. Hanson Natural, Todd Hunter, Andre's Wine. We know Hanson Natural, you've probably seen their sodas around. It's, kind of very sweet, but sodas, but people like them. Todd Hunter, I have no idea what they do. You know what Andre's Wine? I don't know whether the S is silent or not, so I'm going to call it Andre's Wines. They make champagne so cheap that watching the commercials actually gives you a headache. I know most of you might not be at drinking age yet, but if you are, or if you aren't and you're still drinking, you don't have to come and do a confession. I really don't care. On the weekends when I walk down Bleecker, it's amazing how many bottomless mimosa signs I see. You buying bottomless mimosas is Andre wine in that mimosa, not brut or. So if you're expecting, no, do you put the expensive champagne? No, it's bottomless. This is champagne that is sold by the gallon. So I think they bring them out in vats. No, not even bottles. Why did I pick those 3 though? What is it that those 3 companies have? Yes.
Too much randomness.
But well, you could argue that about a lot of those companies. No, it's something very tangible. What makes those 3 companies? Just take a look at the second column. I've given away the answer, Sachi. They have the 3 companies with the PE ratios less than 10. I am very naive. Remember, I told you that I don't like the storytelling, so I said pick these 3 companies. They have the lowest PE ratios. Sachi pushed back on why these companies might not be cheap. Yeah, you want to try first?
That's why I thought you meant.
How? Okay, yeah, that's fine. But you want to try why might these companies look cheap even though they're not cheap? Take a look at it. I've given away the game. What's in the last 2 columns? One is expected growth, and the second is a standard deviation and risk measure. What do Andre's Wines and Todd Hunter have in common? They have the lowest growth rates in the sector, right? What does Hanson Natural have that makes its price earnings ratio low? The highest risk in the sector. There's usually a good reason when something is down in the basement. I'm not saying you shouldn't buy them, but you have to ask questions about the growth and the risk. Yep. What are their assets that you're liquidating though? You're a beverage company. So what exactly are you selling? That'll be a fraction of it. If you're selling barrels to try to get your market cap back, you've already lost the script, right? You're never going to get your money back. The kinds of companies that will have liquidation value that exceeds, you have a lot of real estate, maybe, then you can talk about it. These are not companies where liquidation value can be a big driver. So unfortunately, that can't get your money back. So when you look at these companies, you can see there's a good reason, and that's part of the Brown storytelling. After you've given me it becomes you heard of the famous economist who finally got fired because he didn't have a third hand, right? He said on the one hand and the other hand, and finally the guy said, no, I'm sick and tired of the one, but that's basically what we're doing. On the one hand, they look cheap, on the other hand, they have low growth. On the one hand, they look cheap, on the other hand, they're risky. So storytelling can get you only so far. So I get fired as a beverage analyst after my recommendations. I land on my feet and I go back in time. I'm now the telecom analyst in the late 90s. For those of you who don't know the history of telecom, until the 1980s, other than the US and the rest of the world, the telecom companies, the phone companies, used to be government owned. In the 1980s, they started to privatize these companies around the world. They became publicly traded, and many of them had ADRs listed in the US. What are ADRs? They allow you to buy shares in this company in the US markets, and all their numbers have to be restated using GAAP accounting standards, US accounting standards. So this is what the sector looked like. So now the telecom analysts, I'm still naive. What's my only tool? PE ratios. So now I tell you to buy Indosat. Indosat used to be the Indonesian telecom company in the late 90s, and Telebras. Telebras in the late 90s was the monopoly phone company for all of Brazil. Why again? Low PE ratio. But here again, I've given a one clue as to why those companies might have the lowest PE ratio. They also happen to have really low growth rates. But there's another thing that worries me about these two companies, at least looking at this sector. These are all ADRs, they're all telecom ADRs. But in this sample, if you look at it, there's Indonesia, but also in this sample, you also have the Danish telecom company, the German telecom company. You see where I'm going, right? You've developed market telecom company. You're worried about emerging market risk, right? So you're saying those companies look cheap, but they also have low growth. They also have high risk. And this is why I want to get past the storytelling. I opened up my statistics textbook to the multiple regression chapter. My dependent variable is the PE. My independent variables are, the things I worry about is the growth in earnings. I threw that in there. And then I create what's called a dummy variable for emerging markets. You know what a dummy variable is in statistics? It takes on a value of 0 or 1. It's a very simplistic but powerful way of capturing difference across companies. I took all the emerging market companies and gave them a 1, and developed market companies and called them a 0. I ran the regression and I got an R squared of 66%. A little later in this class, we'll talk about what a good R squared is. But statistics classes ruin you for life, because you have R squares of 95%. I'll tell you quite honestly, if you're running regressions with R squares of 95%, you're testing something not worth testing. Like, is there a link between how much you eat and how much you weigh? Yes, a lot. You eat 50,000 calories a day, you're going to weigh tons. If you eat 500 calories a day, you're going to waste away. And then we run this regression. Later, I've got an R squared of 96%. Congratulations. Anything worth testing is not going to have a 95% R squared, right? Because there's always going to be noise. In this case, 66% is about as good as it's going to get. So let's read the output of the regression. The constant, the intercept is 13.11. What does that tell me? When I run a regression, I see an intercept. At least in this context, I've got telecom ADRs, I've run a regression, I've got an intercept, 13.11. It gives me the level from which I'm going to build off. If the entire sector is highly priced, that intercept is going to be high. If I took AI companies right now, I'm going to start with a really high number and build up. So it's going to tell me something about the overall pricing I'm bringing through the intercept. See the coefficient on the growth rate? 121.22. Anybody want to try to tell me what that means? What is that telling me about them? In fact, it's not just a great effect. Every 1% change in the growth rate increases my PE ratio by 1.2. In other words, if you're a company with a growth rate 10% higher than mine, your PE ratio is going to be about 12 higher than mine. I've quantified the effect of growth. I'm no longer waving my hands and saying higher growth is good. I can actually tell you this is how much your PE should be. But here's the most fascinating piece of output, at least for me. The coefficient in the emerging market dummy variable was minus 13.85. How would I read that? What does that tell me? Yeah.
The emerging market, the PE will be negative 13.85 lower than
In other words, if I have two telecom companies that developed and emerging with the same growth rate, at least when I did this calculation, the emerging market telecom company will have a PE ratio 13.85 lower. Remember, we talked about how country risk affects intrinsic value. There, we brought it in through a country risk premium and a cost of capital. This is a much more, in some ways, honest way of assessing it. Say, what does the market think about country risk? To look at how it's priced. Because country risk matters, you'd price those companies lower. Now, why did I do all of this? Because I thought Telebras looked cheap, right? So what am I going to do? I'm going to take this regression and plug in Telebras's numbers into the regression. 7.5% growth rate, the fact that it's an emerging market company. I get a predicted PE for Telebras after I've controlled for the low growth and the emerging market risk. I get a predicted PE of 8.35. Remember that 8.9 times earnings, which looked cheap to me? Once I control for the low growth and the high risk, Telebras is actually expensive, not cheap. Basically, you go beyond the hand waving, you bring in the effect of growth, you bring in the effect of risk and say, this is what the number should be given the low growth and the high risk. Any questions? So after, yeah, go ahead.
So is that the standard deviation?
It's a standard deviation of stock price. You could use any proxy for risk, right? This is, once you get into pricing, you need a proxy for risk. I use the standard deviation stock price. You could use betas. You could use sector specific numbers, which, with banks, I'll talk about that. But there are no restrictions on how you can get those proxies. So I get fired as the telecom analyst. I land on my feet again. I'm the European banking analyst. How much I know about European banks? Absolutely nothing. But I finally learned one other multiple other than PE ratios. Got me into trouble in the last one. So now I've latched on to price to book ratios. So this is European banks. In 2010, there are the price to book ratios. I won't even try to pronounce the names of these companies, but the cheapest companies at the top. By Rishi, Hippo, something, something. It's a German, German co-op bank. It's a bank basically. It looks cheap, right? Price to book of 0.80. But tell me what concerns you. Its return equity is negative. And the last column, I have risk. It looks like a really risky negative return equity. No wonder it looks cheap. It deserves to be cheap. Here again, if you just, there are two ways I'm going to approach this. One is I'm going to say, let's say you're averse to regressions in statistics, but you still want to find cheap. Help me out here. If I'm looking at this sector and I'm trying to find a cheap bank, I want a low price to book ratio, right? Do I want on return equity, I want a high return equity, and on standard deviation, low standard deviation. You think low or high relative to what? In statistics, when you have a data sample, what do we define low or high relative to? What's typical in the sample? Here's what I did. I computed the median price to book for the sector, the median return on equity, and the median standard deviation. And here's what I went looking for. I went looking for companies that trade at a price to book lower than the median. So let me go back to the previous page. So that basically knocks off everything below the 2.04, right? Which have returns on equity higher than the median. Okay. In fact, I think there's only one company with a return equity higher than the median, which might be BNP Paribas. I'm rubbing my hands together. This is good. I've got low price to book. I've got high return equity. And then I look at the standard deviation and it's higher than the average. So basically I got 2 out of 3, but I didn't get all 3. See, why did we even do this in the first place? You'll never find anything if you don't even look. But basically, that's the eyeballing approach. We look for things that trade at below the median or above the median, and you try to find cheap things so you don't need to bring any statistical tools. Sachi? We'll go back to multiple, price to book, right? Remember we did that intrinsic value calculation for each multiple? That's why we do it, because when you do that, you get a sense of what variables you can include in your regression. That's why we do it, because otherwise we never use that intrinsic value equation. But without doing it, you're going to, and you see these regressions often run with price to book against margin. You say, what are you doing? If it's EV to sales, you might use margin. So basically, that's how you make that choice. Yes. Again, if you want, again, I'm going to leave them at linear. You know why? This is not a statistics class. If this were a statistics class, you could make the entire class about finessing and improving the regressions, and it's worth the effort. But I don't want to go there because each regression will, it's a great way to teach statistics, if you ask me. So if you go back to your statistics class, you can convince your statistics professor to take this data and use it to talk about nonlinear regressions and checking for normality. I think it's more productive because if you do it well, you can actually make some money on it. When was the last time you ran a statistics regression in a statistics class that you could make money on. This is actually something that has a direct payoff if you do it better. So I agree with you. This is low tech statistics, but I'm going to leave it at low tech because it is something that you can improve by bringing better statistics. You heard of quant investing? What I'm doing is a subset of quant investing. That's what quant investors do. That's why they hire, math and statistics majors from, why they don't hire finance majors. There's nothing finance about this, right? It's really about understanding data and statistics because what you're trying to do is control for differences. Now, of course, as with the previous one, if you do the median approach, the promise, it takes you only so far. I ran the regression again. Price to book against return on equity and standard deviation of the stock price. The numbers in brackets below the T statistics. All statistically significant, R squared 79%. After I ran this regression, I rethought the standard deviation stock price. It's kind of an easy number to get. But if you think about banks as an investor, and you think about risk in banks, what is the number, what is the variable that you might want to use as a proxy for risk, especially focused on banks? What makes some banks risky, you say? Interest rates overall. It's a macro effect, but it'll affect all banks. I want something that'll vary across banks, right? That's going to be tough to do, right? And I like the way you're thinking, but think of the data you will need to do that for 50 banks, right? I'm sorry? You could do, but that's an income approach. That should already be in your return equity. Country risk is a factor. So we have different risks in banks. How much they're holding versus how much they've invested. What do the banks invest in? They make loans, right? I mean, I'm not sure. Yeah. They don't invest it, they loan it out, right? A bank basically takes deposits and lends them out and makes money on the spread. There's no investing in a bank per se. It's basically making loans and charging a high enough rate. Are banks regulated? What makes you worry about a bank from a regulatory perspective? The regulatory capital gets too low. Remember when we talked about valuing banks, we talked about that is public information for all of these banks. If I were doing this in 2024, I could have got a tier 1 capital ratio. What will that tell you? Which banks are overcapitalized, which are regular capitalization, which were low. And rather than use standard deviation, I'd have said an undercapitalized bank is risky. So there the tier 1 capital ratio will become a proxy for risk. But what I'm saying is when you're doing pricing, be creative about how to think about risk in a particular group or a sector, because that's going to play out. And I use that regression to get predicted price to book ratios for each of the banks. So there's my buyer receiver. It looks undervalued, but not by as much when I just looked at even after controlling for the low negative return equity and the high risk. No, it still looks cheap. So I'm not saying cheap banks won't stay cheap, but now that this comparison is a much fairer one, rather than compare across banks, you compare each bank's price to book to what it should be, given its return equity and its risk. I get fired from this job as well. I can't hold a job. So I decide I'm going to become a market strategist. I look across companies. Now, remember, the reason we stay sector focused is because of differences in growth and risk across companies, right? But with regressions, we can control for those differences. If we can control for those differences, I can compare companies which are in different sectors, as long as I can control for the differences. These are the 100 largest market cap stocks in 2010. It's called a scatter plot. Basically, I've taken the 100 stocks, I compute the price to book and the return equity for each one. So if you want, you can count these points. There should be 100 points. You're a type A personality or whatever personality you are and say, guy's lying to me. I think there are only 98. Go ahead and count. There are 100 points, each company. So that's a scatter plot. What are these lines that I seem to have drawn maybe randomly through them? What's this middle line, you think? Best fit line. How do I get that? That looks better. No, what's a statistical criteria for the best fit line? Do you remember? minimizes the least squared distances. You know, the Greeks came up with this. They actually sat there and measured each distance, squared it, added up. Can you imagine how tedious running a regression must have been 2,000 years ago? And some guy in the Athens beach sitting there says, that doesn't look right there. No, let me, I don't even know what they used to measure it. Thank God for statistics packages that do it for you. That is my best fit line. What do you think these two outside lines are? Actually, 90%. Basically, if you have a good regression package, Minitab, I think, is the one that you have. When you run a regression, it'll actually ask you, do you want me to draw the 90th percentile? What does that mean? Anything that falls between those two lines, I cannot reject the hypothesis that they're fairly priced. But let's think about, there are a few of the dots that fall outside the 90 percentile lines. First, let me ask you a question. Which side are my underpriced stocks on? Are they below the line or above the line? Where are my underpriced stocks here? Low price to book, high return equity. There are my 3 underpriced stocks. And there are my 3 overpriced stocks. I'll list out the 3 overpriced stocks and you tell me what I might be missing with those stocks. In 2010, these were Google, Infosys, and Gilead. Google, of course, then was a young growth company growing 30–40% a year. Infosys was an Indian outsourcing company growing 20% a year. And Gilead then was also growing 15 or 20%. You see why I emphasize the growth rate, right? When I do price to book against return equity, what am I implicitly assuming about growth across these companies? It must be roughly similar. I'm missing growth. You think that's fatal? Is there a way I can bring growth into my scatter plot? That, of course, but I want to do it visually. Have you ever seen a 3-dimensional scatter plot? They're terrifying. Because this is what it looks like. It looks like a box. Think, what the heck am I going to do? It's price to book, return equity, expected growth. You can do this in Excel. I get dizzy even looking at this, but I want you to stay dizzy and tell me where in this box your cheap stocks are, right? So think of a cardboard box. So first, you want low price to book or high price to book? Low price to book, low return equity, high return equity. High return equity, low growth or high growth? There, that's the corner of the box. What's there? Nothing. But the closest I get is TWX, Time Warner. In 2010, I said Time Warner looks like the cheapest of the stocks because it's closest to the corner. That corner up there is your devil's corner. Everything is working against you. High price to book, low return equity, low growth. It's, again, it's nice to have a visual presentation rather than a multiple regression, because even somebody who's never seen a regression gets it visually. So that's, I bring growth in. So you've got price to book, return equity, and growth. There's still one missing variable, right? Risk. You're saying, can I bring it and make it a 4-dimensional graph? You're now in territory I can't even go to. But I did do a 3-dimensional graph with risk by bringing in beta. Again, I'm doing the same thing. I'm looking for that combination that is cheap. Yep. Yeah, you can do regressions, right? Basically, you can do principal components. The reason we leave the visual domain is visual domains are constrained. So once you get past 3 dimensions, visually it's difficult. But in terms of analytics, I can run a multiple regression. In fact, I run a regression with all 3 variables. I can make it 5, 7 regressions. I'm not restricted. In this case, with the bringing in beta growth and return equity, I can tell you what the predicted price to book should be for every one of these 100 companies. At the start of every year, I do this just for fun. I know it sounds weird, but it takes about 5 minutes to do. Take the 100 largest market cap companies, download their price to book ratios and returns on equity. You want to see what the start of 2024 looked like? It was 2010. What the heck are you going to do? Here's what my 2024 picture looked like. Again, I've done exactly the same thing. And again, the companies that fall below the line, and the more below the line you fall, the more undervalued you are. And the companies that fall above the line, I have a lot more falling outside the line, right? What's the most undervalued stock in the US, if you believe this scatter plot? Verizon. What's the most overvalued stock in the US, if you believe this regression? Eli Lilly. So the reason I actually do these regressions is, somebody asked me early in the class, they said, I want to pick a company to value, but I want to pick a company which is going to come out as undervalued because I want to be able to buy the stock, which seems like you're getting ahead of yourselves. So how would you know? I can give you a way in which you're more likely to find an undervalued company. You're valuing Verizon, you're more likely to find an undervalued company because you're starting with the numbers working in your favor. You start with Eli Lilly, it's going to be really difficult to find your intrinsic valuation give you an undervaluation because you're starting with a high number. I actually followed up by looking at the stuff that's happening at the two companies to see, because that's always worth doing, right? This is just price to book, return equity from 1 year. Maybe there's something I'm missing. With Verizon, here's what I saw. Their book value of equity has doubled over the last 4 years. They've done acquisitions, they've brought in all kinds of stuff. Their net income has decreased over the last 4 years. So there's forces working against. So even though the return equity looks good, the trend lines are not great. So markets looks at that and say, you know what, we're pricing you based on expectations for the future. With Eli Lilly, what's the bump coming from? It's an old, mature pharma company, right? Yesterday, I saw a list of the 10, because weight loss drugs are now the big thing. They're the 10 biggest ones. Ozempic and Wegovy are on that list, but they're I was surprised. They were number 5 and 6 on the list in terms of, growth and revenues. 3 of those 10 drugs were Eli Lilly drugs. Weight loss is the AI for in the medical business now. You have a great weight loss drug. There's the weight loss pumping up a premium. Doesn't mean it's overpriced. It just might mean that weight loss drug can deliver revenues. I mean, you probably see NVIDIA is above the list too. There's the AI effect. Again, when you get something pushing up the pricing that's not yet in the book value and the income, it is going to pop these stocks above the list. Any questions about? So now I get fired for a 5th time. I'm getting tired of getting fired. And this time, they made me the analyst for the trucking sector. This is like equity research hell that you've landed up in. Okay. And I've decided to abandon these equity multiples. I've decided my problem. That's the reason I keep getting fired. I need to do what these big analysts seem to be doing. I use an EB to EBITDA. I'm going to skip the first company on the list. KLLM, I have no idea, what they do, but Rider Systems, that's a familiar name, right? You see it all over the country, moving trucks. Why do I like Rider Systems? Because it's trading at 2.8 times EBITDA. The sector average is 5.6. The median is about 5.8. This stock looks cheap because it trades at a really low EV to EBITDA. Ask me the questions. It could be cheap. What's the first question you're going to ask me about the company that might lead you to not buy the company? What were your concerns with? Yeah. One is growth, right? So basically, maybe it's a low growth company. Unfortunately, this entire sector is mired in 3 to 5% growth. So growth is not wildly different. So that's off the table. What next? Risk. And so maybe Rider Systems gets has 80% of its trucks in, I don't know, Bolivia. It didn't turn out to be the case. Almost all of these companies are US focused. So the risk was pretty much equivalent. So it's not growth, it's not risk. What is it? Cross holdings, no, these are US trucking companies. Very difficult to do much in cross holding. But that's a good question. If you have family group companies, it could be it. Would you worry about reinvestment? I remember high reinvestment companies. With trucking, though, reinvestment takes a very unique form. Trucking companies replace their entire fleets once every 5, 6, 7 years because they get a much better, discount if they replace the entire fleet. They don't reinvest in equal amounts every year. So ask me the question about Rider Systems on reinvestment framed in those terms. How old is the fleet? That's exactly the question I asked. And it was actually public information. They're the oldest fleet in the sector. I'll tell you what's going to happen. You're going to buy Rider because it looks cheap. And 2 weeks later, 4 weeks later, 6 weeks later, you're going to open up the Wall Street Journal. And here's the news story you're going to read. Ryder System raises $4 billion in capital to buy new trucks. There goes your 2.8 times EBITDA to 5 times EBITDA. The cheapness disappears. This actually was an actual equity research analyst recommendation by Ryder Systems based on the EV to EBITDA. And I looked through his report to see if he was even asking the right questions, and he didn't even bother. The data was all there. All he needed to do is add an extra column to that table, and he'd have seen the problem. And that's what I said early on. I don't have a problem with pricing. People do it all the time. I think it makes sense. But I have a problem with lazy pricing where you don't ask the right questions. One of the ways you can tell good equity research apart from very average or below average, a good equity research analyst will take a multiple, will take the comparables and ask all the questions. You might not like the way he answers the questions or she answers the questions, but you need to ask the questions, check them off before you say this stock is cheap. So when you look at Ryder Systems and you look at the low multiple of EBITDA, what's driving it is the fact that their reinvestment is just coming up and you're catching them just ahead of that reinvestment. In fact, with infrastructure companies, if any of you doing infrastructure companies, be very careful with multiples like EV to EBITDA, because depending on where you are in the life cycle, your EV to EBITDA can vary dramatically over a life cycle. Young infrastructure companies, if you look at their EV, the EV will be high because people expect them to do well, but the EBITDA will not be there. It's almost infinite. And then as they mature, the EV to EBITDA will get lower. So if you just pick companies based on EV to EBITDA with infrastructure companies, you get a lot of ancient infrastructure companies in your portfolio because you're catching them late in the life cycle. So now I get fired again. I become the grocery store analyst, incredibly boring business. What does a typical grocery store business look like? Low growth and low margins. Take a look at Kroger's, right? It's a very good grocery store company, but it's low growth and low margins. And the equity research analysts who live in this space are used to companies with low growth and low margins. But once in a while, you get a newcomer into a sector that doesn't look like any of the companies you've looked at before, right? In 2007, that happened in the grocery sector. A new company showed up called Whole Foods. Whole Foods is a very different grocery company in terms of how it approaches the market. And equity research analysts had absolutely no idea what to do with it. Take a look at the pricing. There are all the other grocery stores. There's Whole Foods. And of course, as an analyst, if I ask you, why is Whole Foods trading at 1.41 times revenues? What's your storytelling aspect? Why would Whole Foods have a higher EV to sales than a typical grocery store? Higher margins, right? Have you bought eggplant at Whole Foods? You pay 3 times more than eggplant in that, that Kroger's or Pathmark. You get organic eggplant and supposedly, but no. It's a higher margin business. So that was the story. So I said, okay, I understand it's higher margins. So I ran a regression and I used an inconsistent multiple because they were using price to sales. I stayed in their domain, but I used net margin then because if you use price to sales, which is an equity multiple, you got to stay with the net income version of margin. And I said, you're right, their margins are higher than the typical grocery store company. But even with those higher margins, the predicted price to sales ratio, again, is much lower than what I see out there. I remember writing this in 2008, and people said, you're missing the glory of Whole Foods. It's a really amazing company. And I said, maybe you're right. 2 years later, I looked at the same sector again. Where the heck is Whole Foods? It's clearly not above the line. It actually is the most it's not quite below the line, but it's the closest to being below the line. It went from being the most overpriced grocery store to the most underpriced grocery store. The story is not over. 1 year later, I looked again. Oh, back again to above the line. So it's going from above the line to below the line to above the line. What the heck? What do you think is happening here? You'd think of rational explanations. People just don't understand something. What do? They overreact to whatever's happening in the most recent past. And that's going to be the case anytime you have a newcomer who's different from. It takes years before analysts can deal with these companies. I remember Tesla first started getting priced by equity research analysts. People just had no idea what to do because it was definitely not a typical automobile company. When you look at Airbnb against hotels, really, so when you get these companies that are out of the pack, you will get this phenomenon. Eventually, markets learn. It took, in the case of Whole Foods, it took 6 years before investors finally, and then Amazon bought them. I thought, finally, I can use Whole Foods now for another 10 years, gone off the sample. But to show you that nothing is permanent, in 2015, you got a newcomer in this list. It's a company called Sprouts. Sprouts is more West Coast based than East Coast based, but it's again very much like Whole Foods, bins of food, really, everything one at incredibly high prices. So if you dump too much in your bag, you might go bankrupt when you get to the cash registers. They bought lots of almonds today. That'll cost you $253. Right? But it's a high price, high margin business. So this is something you're going to see play out. In every example so far, though, notice when I run regressions, the numbers are nice in terms of R-squareds and predictive values. I'm going to prepare you for something that some of you will run into when you price your company. So you have a company, you have your peer group, you put your scatter plot up and you know already you're in trouble. Rather than being abstract, let me take you back to January 2000. Remember when I valued Amazon, I showed you that intrinsic valuation? Kind of act like you do. It was a while back. I valued Amazon at 35. The stock was at 84. I told you the stock was overvalued. At that same time, I decided to price Amazon against other internet stocks. So this is the internet sector at the peak of the dot-com boom. The scatter plot. When you look at that scatter plot and you think about a best fit line, what comes to mind? It looks like a shotgun blast, right? I mean, trying to find a pattern there is good. You already know that if you run a regression of price to sales against net margins, what kind of R squared are you going to see? Close to zero. And that's exactly what I found. The T statistic is insignificant, which makes sense. The scariest number was the sign on the net margin was negative. What does that mean? The more negative your net margin, the higher your price to sales ratio. Maybe some .com companies took this to mind and say, you lose $1 billion, we can lose 2. We can actually make that 4 billion because the more I lose, the more pricey I get as a company. But you can't use that regression to decide whether Amazon is cheap or expensive. So I'm going to give you 2 tactics you can try. If this is the case with your sector, the R squared is terrible. So what do I do? Here's the first one. Rather than use the traditional variables are what you got from the intrinsic value section, price to book, it's return equity, growth, and payout. Think about what investors are pricing in. I mean, let me take you back to the .com sector. Now, I'll state a couple of hypotheses about these companies, and you tell me whether you agree with them or not. I would expect companies with higher revenue growth to be priced higher than companies with lower revenue growth. Earnings are off the table. They're all losing money, but higher earnings. I would expect that price to sales ratio to get smaller as revenues get bigger. Why? Because if you're $1 million company, you can trade at 100 times revenues, but if you're $1 billion company, that becomes more difficult. That's my second hypothesis. And the third is if you think about how companies like these in the internet, in the .com sector get into trouble, they run out of cash. Cash allows you to survive. So I would hypothesize that companies with more cash will be able to survive better. And if they can survive better, they should trade at higher price to sales ratios. And then I ran a regression of price to sales against the level of revenues. Log revenues captures the level of revenues, revenue growth to capture the growth rate, and how much cash companies had as a percentage of revenues. I got an R squared of 32%. Was I disappointed? I was deliriously happy because if I could explain 32% of what's going on in this crazy sector, I'm way ahead of the pack. The key statistics were fine on growth and cash, but I might as well take the revenues out. It's really not significant. But if I plug in Amazon's numbers into that regression, I get a predicted price to sales ratio for Amazon of 30.42. So what do I do with that? Stock was actually trading at 25.6 times revenues. Based on this regression, I would conclude that Amazon is underpriced or overpriced. It's underpriced by about 20%. And here's a contradiction I want you to explain. I did this right after I did my intrinsic valuation, right? In my intrinsic valuation, what did I say? The stock is overvalued. 5 minutes later, I come back to say, but it's underpriced. How can a stock be both overvalued and underpriced at the same time?
The industry is way overpriced.
I'm answering two different questions, right? When I do a valuation, what's the question I'm asking? Given the business and the cash flows and the growth and the risk, what do I think about the company? I get an answer. When I do a pricing, what's the question I'm asking? Given how the market is pricing other internet stocks, does the stock look cheap or expensive? Many of you are, I mean, you haven't done the pricing, but you have a DCF value for your company already where you found your company to be over or undervalued. You will be doing a pricing. Don't be surprised if your pricing gives you an answer that's different from your valuation. You don't have anything to explain. You're answering two different questions when you do a pricing as opposed to a valuation. So that's the first thing to do is run the regression with things that should matter. In every sector, what you're going to notice is that thing will vary over time because as the business gets more mature, you're going to start to see more traditional variables show up. But initially, at least, you see this. That's the first way. Here's the second tactic. One reason young companies in particular are difficult to price is there's not much there. You know what I mean by not much there? Revenues are tiny, you're losing money, there's no book value. So every multiple, you're running into a problem because there's nothing tangible there. But in your DCF, remember what you're doing. You're making your small revenues into big revenues, your losses into profits, your invested capital from a negative number to a positive number, right? What if instead of pricing your company against revenues today, you priced it against revenues 5 or 10 years out? It's called forward multiples. You do them because you have more tangible numbers. 5 or 10 years out, your revenues are actually meaningful. You're actually making money. But I'm going to introduce a cautionary note. When you do this, and a lot of analysts do this, you got to remember to clean up. Now, to illustrate what I mean by cleaning up, let's say, and this is a typical equity research forward multiple, they'll say the EBITDA 5 years from now is expected to be 2 billion. Companies typically in the sector trade at 10 times EBITDA. 10 times 2 billion is 20 billion. And then they will say, that's my value today. What am I missing when I take the 20 billion that I got by taking EBITDA 5 years from now, applying a multiple? What's the first thing that I'm missing if I call that my value today? EBITDA 5 years from now times a multiple gives me value 5 years from now, right? First thing I'm missing is the time value of money. To illustrate how much your value can drain as I go from that forward multiple to what the value is today. And I valued Tesla in 2013. I did a discounted cash flow valuation and I had a terminal value of 68 billion. But my value of equity was only 8 billion. People said, how the heck did you get from 68 to 8 billion? So I actually wrote a post explaining why the 68 billion in terminal value kind of became 8 billion. The first effect, I said, if I discount back at the risk-free rate, just pure time value, the 68 billion becomes 52 billion. So that's just time value. If I bring in the risk through a cost of capital that's risk adjusted, the 52 billion becomes 28 billion. I've gone from 68 billion to 28 billion just with the present value effects, but I'm not quite done. Remember that Tesla is still a money-losing company with negative free cash flows to equity, at least in 2013. What is that going to mean? If I take the present value of the free cash flows, the negative cash flows I have for the next 4, 5, 6 years, that reduces my 28 billion down to 12.8 billion. I'm bringing in the dilution effect through the negative cash flows. And then I clean up for failure risk and debt and cash. My 68 billion becomes 8 billion. So if you're using forward multiples, now remember the time value of money, remember the negative cash flows, all of those will eat into your value today. So when you're doing pricing, you're basically letting the market tell you what matters, right? You initially start out with what should matter, cash flows, growth, and risk. But the market says, look, I don't care about any of that stuff. You've got to respect the market. You are in the pricing game. So let's talk a little bit about what you might do with companies where the market is pricing something that's not in your financials. In 2013, Twitter went public. At the time of their IPO, I did a discounted cash flow value for the company, and I came up with a value of $18 per share. At the same time, I wanted to do a pricing for the company. To price Twitter, here's what I did. I collected other social media companies which were publicly traded. I got their market caps and enterprise values. I collected the accounting numbers, revenue, EBITDA, and net income. But I also collected the number of users that each of these companies had. And then I computed multiples, EV to EBITDA, EV to revenues. I tried PE, but then I very quickly realized how many companies I was losing because they had negative earnings. And I said, which of these multiples is the best one? And many of you will face this challenge. You have 4 different multiples. Which one is the best one? What's the answer to that? It's data driven, whichever one works the best in explaining differences, right? Statistically, what are you looking at? You're looking at the correlation between each multiple and the actual market cap, right? If I can explain 99% of what's going on in terms of differences, that's a better multiple. So I tried revenues, I tried EBITDA. And so if you look down the first column, of course, market cap and enterprise value very highly correlated. They measure the same thing. But you look at the 4 variables I used, it wasn't even close. My best predictor of market cap and enterprise value in the sector was the number of users you had as a social media company. In fact, if you look at what you're paying, roughly speaking, the market was paying about $100 per user. Let's say you're the investment bank in this IPO. What's your job as a banker in an IPO? To price a company or value the company? Price. So you want to price Twitter. There are 240 million users. Finish the pricing for me. You don't need a calculator. How much is the market paying per user? Roughly $100. You got 240 million users. What's your pricing for Twitter? 24 billion. Which was, if you translate into value per share, was about $45. Guess what Twitter went public at? Roughly $45 per share. Pricing is basically taking whatever the market cares and then building it in. Doesn't mean it's right or wrong. It is what you're going to get in the market. And you got to pick what works in your sector. Now, when social media companies first came into being, it was number of users. And then markets realized that not all users were created equal. Why is a Facebook user worth more than a Snapchat user? Stays on there because to sell you advertising, you need to be in my, the typical Facebook, and this is one of the most depressing statistics I've ever seen. The typical Facebook user stays in the Facebook ecosystem 57 minutes every day. This is not me. Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, count up. You do your own calculation. Don't tell anybody. I wouldn't be surprised if some of you are spending more than 57 minutes. The typical Snapchat user, even if you're doing Snapchat stories, it's 5 minutes and you move on, right? What are you going to do? Sitting in Snapchat, watching for somebody to write a story? So by 2016, you know what people are looking at, not just how many users, but the intensity of users measured by the time they spend. So as businesses mature, there will be a shifting in the metric reflecting the maturing of the business. I'll tell you right now with AI, there is no metric out there yet. So I'm curious about what people will start pricing AI companies to. It can't be revenues, can't be earnings, there's nothing there. What is it in AI that you're going to target as your metric? There will be one. And when it comes, it's going to be this very rough metric, but it'll evolve over time. Yes.
So, bigger points of data.
Of all, when you say all of the financial data, Capital IQ has, right? The revenue, EBITDA. Right? Users will not be on Capital IQ, but it's actually very easy to get. I mean, there are 100 different sources on this that you can get, which lists it. The intensity is tougher. Facebook started, I think, measuring intensity internally, so it's tougher to get that intensity. You often have to. But once you leave the financial data, it's you're looking in different places, filling them all in, right? So once you control for differences, nothing stops you within a sector. Can I price a company against the rest of the market? That's a lot of companies out there, right? There are hundreds and hundreds of companies, different growth rates, different risk. Why not? Why can't I run a regression of PE ratios against growth, payout, and risk against for all companies in the market? For almost 30 years in the US, at the start of the year, I run this regression because I have the raw data. So start of 2024, I wanted to run the regression. And before I got my hopes up too high about what the regression would look like, I ran a scatter plot just to see how good my regression is going to be of P against growth rate. Growth is your strongest variable. So I was hoping when I did the scatter plot, I get this nice, neat line, everything, which is not what I got. There is a positive relationship, but there's a heck of a lot of noise, right? Noise in the sense. So you know what this prepares me for? When I run this regression of price earnings ratio against growth and other factors, what kind of R squared should I expect to see? Not 90, not 80, but if I'm lucky, 20 or 30%. In fact, I was pleasantly surprised. The R squared I got was about 34%. The variables I used were beta, payout, and growth. Why did I stop there? Because those are the variables that showed up with my intrinsic value calculation, beta. So this is not a kitchen sink regression. You know what a kitchen sink regression is? You've all probably been guilty of it. I've been guilty of it in statistics classes. What's your objective in a kitchen sink regression? To get the highest R squared you can get. So whatever improves the R squared, you throw it in. Heavy CEO companies have higher price earnings ratio. You throw the weight of the CEO in. Now, is there a public database of that? I don't know, but maybe somebody should create it. Yeah. So you throw it in because it works. I'm not going there because I'm going to stop with the things that should matter. This is my starting point, but as was pointed earlier, this is very basic statistics. And I'll make a confession. This regression has some issues. In fact, if you look at the output from the regression, the coefficients, first you have a negative intercept, which already is a little tricky because it can happen, because all you do is the best fit line, you can get a negative intercept. But if you look at the coefficients, the ones on beta and growth make sense, higher growth and higher payout rate. But the one on beta actually has the wrong sign. You see what I mean by the wrong side? Higher risk companies should have lower P ratios, but this one has. There's a statistical reason why that's happening, but I'll set up that because we'll start the next class, we'll talk about this. So first is, we talked about this is a linear regression. Maybe it's a non-linear relationship. But the two other things we're going to talk about is non-stationarity, that things can change over time, and this magical word called multicollinearity. So if you get a chance before Monday, look up that word, because that's going to tell you why the beta has the wrong sign on the coefficient. Yeah. Yeah.
Based on what?
Are you doing line item by line item, or are you doing overall? Then there's all kinds of issues. Internally, it could create companies that are inconsistent. That's why you don't want. I mean, that's why historically, you already talked about historical growth. You do line item. I'll give you an example. You take CapEx and you project it based on historic. Take depreciation project for CapEx and you go with depreciation is going 5%. You let them go out. And anyway, depreciation is connected. There, it comes out of your capital. Financial statements are all interconnected. The problem with line item based forecasting is there's interconnections in there. But basically, I do quite honest, time series models are not going to hit you. I mean, all they do is give you some kind of a basis for future. But let's say you have a time series of models. What does that help me? The trend lines might not, but there might be a story there about why my margins are decreasing or increasing over time. If you're learning about your company, there's nothing wrong with using the time to learn about your company, but the bottom line evaluation is those final forecasting choices first have to be more parsimonious. You can't forecast 100 lines. You've got to forecast aggregate lines. So rather than forecast revenues, cost of goods sold, you forecast revenues and operating margin. You're not doing 16 line items. But that operating margin should have everything you think about in terms of what's happening to the expense side at the time. So if you learn something about expenses, and what you're trying to learn is economic intuition, right? So when you look at expenses,
rather than look at the expenses themselves, you look at expenses of percent of revenue. Why? Because it's going to tell you something about economies of scale of this company. Which items are scaling with the company, and that then becomes the basis for your story. You're saying 80% expenses of this company have nothing to do with revenue. So if my revenues are growing, I'd expect my margins to go up because much of my costs are fixed costs and economies of scale. Again, in contrast, your revenues will grow together. When you forecast things out, your margin will stay low because you can't, your expenses go the same way. Remember, that's a tool. You're learning from the data, right? The data is not driving your forecast. It's giving you information that you use to make it. Okay. Yeah. Hello? 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 Yeah, right.
Yeah, I was just wondering, is it possible to put quizzes for quiz number 2? Is can you just like come to your office hour next
Right?
week?
No, you come right,
Oh.
right now and just take it now before. It's here, I'm using it. Yes, ma'am. You're going to come in here. You had a question? Yeah. Yeah. But tell me a story if you want. But COVID was in 2020. Let's stop talking about COVID, right? So COVID is done. 4 years passed. So at this point, you're post-COVID. So any, you believe your own story. The story sounds a little macro. Is it what does it have to do with the company? So short term, to increase margins, you've got to be able to raise prices, right? That's basically it. So, but I'm saying, tell me the first part of the story as to why they're able to raise prices in the next few years. What is it that they're able to do in the next few years that gives them a higher price?
Because it's like they had a lot of programs.
That's a growth story. Margin story is about pricing. It's about being able to raise prices without competition. Don't mix your growth stories with margin stories. If you want to tell me a story about higher margins, it's got to be margin focused. Right.
It's being through the market share.
Okay, so it's gaining huge market share. So it's able to raise prices because there's more market power. So why does it lose it after 40%?
Because there are like some other competition.
So why does it take 4 years for the competition to show up? So why don't they do it right now? Why are they waiting 4 years for this model to come in?
It's just like always it's doing like on the margin.
No, I'm telling you, I'm okay with the story, but you gotta convince yourself. You don't sound like you're convincing yourself about the story. So you need a story that actually explains why margins go up and they have a lot of pricing power for the next 4 years. And then margins start to go down because they lose pricing power. An example would be if there's 4 years of exclusivity in the market, no competition can come in, and then 4 years the government's going to open up the market to competition, then I get it, right? But that's not the story I'm hearing here. Right? Something like that should never be part of your story. You got to get your story with focus. Right now, you're all over the place in terms of your story, right? So you're, I think, reverse engineering a number you put in and you say, what kind of story can I tell for what I have in the numbers? That's not the way it's supposed to work, right? We start with a story and the numbers have to come out of it. If you truly believe that they have some protection from competition for the next few years, they're going to be able to raise prices, then make that part of your story, but explain why they have protection from competition. What is it that's keeping a competition out? And then you can say, as competition increases, my margins are going to converge back. Usually when competition increases, usually not your margins that converge back, it's your growth that goes back down because now you've got to share the market with other players because margins are set more by unit economics than by.
What is the business model and like the charting like both sides, but
so how are margins going to go up? So it's going to raise that low price. That low price is what's going to allow it to grow. So for your growth story, you say they're growing because they have a low price. And you can't tell them that same story that your margins are going to go up because you're raising prices, right? Then the margin should stay stable. Why are the margins going up? Right? I'm not saying it's true. Your story doesn't convince me is what I'm saying, and it doesn't. Yeah. It's different. Yours to convergence just brings your margin towards your target. You're talking about something different, right? You're talking about a company where, so you're starting with a high margin and converging on a lower margin. What's happening in your evaluation? No, but what you're starting with a low or a high margin? And what is the target margin? So your margin's not going down, it's going up. So that's, so what's the point of the whole story you told, a margin going up and then going down? I'm not getting it because then you set the number. So you entered the 29, so you want something lower, enter a lower number, right? It's your story, right? That depends on your story, right? But margins are the output from your business model, but what you're trying to do. You know, and so it has to come from what you tell me as your story for growth. It's got to be tied to your margins as well. To start, it's not okay. It's whether it's okay or not, it is what it is, right? If it's negative upfront, it is negative upfront. This is very frustrating. I've lost. Okay.
I just have a question regarding the quiz. Do you still have them by any chance?
Yes, I'm gonna. If you come up with me, and he's
Okay.
coming as well. So. And before I go up, because this whole thing becomes worthless if I can't find that dongle. So. check on the ground to see, basically, the last triangle that goes to here.